welcome. I know we said some new people or some people that may be here some of the time. This is our Tuesday secular discussion group. We kind of will sometimes have a remote speaker in, but it seems like it's more popular when we have kind of our own members. And John Phillips will be speaking today, who's a MM member. He's also a very good photographer. Check his blog, Skeptic Photo, right?
Yes.
Is that it? Take a Google on that. Very good, especially with architectural stuff. His camera is definitely better than mine. And it's good stuff there. He's going to speak on the nature of the afterlife. Also, if you don't know, Mythos Milwaukee is making a movie, Batman and Jesus, which is going to be premiered September 30th at the Pabst as part of the next big event. So take a look at that. Check out the trailer if you haven't seen that. Sean Carroll's going to be on the podcast next week, so that's cool. And I will leave it to you, sir.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. So first, maybe a little clarification on the title of my discussion topic. I really meant it to be not the nature of the afterlife, but the existence of the afterlife and the soul. And because, to be honest, I want to make the argument that there isn't an afterlife. So I don't want to talk about the nature of it because I don't think it exists. And the other thing I wanted to say up front is that I look at this as an opportunity for a discussion for us to talk about it as a group. More than me giving a lecture, I really want this to be something where I can sort of help us explore a topic that I found to be interesting in thinking about. I have to say, too, I'm a rank amateur at this in terms of being knowledgeable about the afterlife. I have no personal experience, and I haven't really done an extensive amount of study on the afterlife other than just, pass through life and hear what other people have to say about it. So having said that, I'd first start with a show of hands as to how many people believe in the afterlife, that there is an afterlife. Okay, well, one brave soul. How many people feel that the afterlife is, that you're in effect agnostic about the existence of the afterlife? Oh, that's better. Well, I'm hoping I can maybe change your mind about that a little bit. And I thought I'd start with some statistics about belief in the afterlife. This is based on a Pew Research study from fairly recent, 2015. Basically, it said, and I find this a little, I don't quite trust these numbers, but I do have a lot of respect for Pew. They said that 72% of U.S. adults believe in heaven. Now, it's different from the afterlife. And 58% believe in hell. But that's the closest proxy I could come to just a pure, afterlife per se. Breaking that down a little bit, 85% of Christians believe in heaven. A small, just slightly smaller percentage, maybe in the 70s, believe in hell. Among Christians, among Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, it's closer to 50%. And among atheists, it's 5%, which is pretty close to what this population seems to be. And among agnostics, 14% believe in heaven. And, again, these kinds of numbers depend on how they ask the question, in my view. Okay, so how did I? The reason I'm doing this tonight is because one of our members, in a discussion we had in a setting sort of like this a few months ago, made a comment, and I don't want to embarrass this person who's around, but he said, Science really hasn't answered the question of what happens to us after we die. They haven't provided a definitive answer to that. And I said to myself, "What? Are you kidding? Of course we know what happens when we die. Our heart stops beating, our brain starts to, stops functioning, we start to deteriorate, and our body corrupts. Okay, that's really what happens to us when we die. And I think what was hidden in this comment was this idea of us or we. What happens to us when we die? What happens to an individual when he or she dies? And I think what's hidden in there is this idea of some other agency beyond your physical body. And I think what it's really saying is that most of us, maybe all of the people here, when you were growing up, you were basically dualists. You believed in a body and a mind. You believe, people grow up thinking, I have a body and I have a mind. I can, I'm thinking, I'm looking out at the world, I'm perceiving the world, I'm aware of the world, and that's separate from my body. And in fact, most people believe that their mind is in control of their body. That if they choose to do something, they direct their body to do that. And I think that's how most of us grew up thinking, if I can use that word, thinking. But I think that that's incorrect. And this is the sort of the underlying basis for my argument about the existence of the afterlife. Because I think when people talk about the afterlife, they're really talking about some agency beyond the human body, because we can all see what happens to our bodies when we die. Okay, the body corrupts, and it turns into whatever it was. And it must, if there is an afterlife, then it concerns the mind, if you want to talk about the mind. It doesn't concern the body, at least initially. And that, I think, is how most people who believe in something, in an afterlife, an immortality, or a soul, that's how they think. And what I'd like to do is sort of offer to you an argument that's not correct. That we don't have a mind that's separate from, independent of, that acts independently of, or that acts in control of the body. So when the body disintegrates, there is nothing left that could persist in an afterlife. That's my argument. So how do we get there? And by the way, anybody that as we go along here, if you have a question, or if you have a comment, or if you have an opinion, just don't hesitate to chime in and share your thinking with the rest of the group. Okay. So what I'm going to say is that when we think about the mind or consciousness, most people will accept the idea that there is a consciousness, because we do see things, we perceive what's out there, we're thinking all the time, we have dreams, something's going on in our heads. And so that's what we refer to as consciousness. But I think for people who have a belief in the afterlife, or a belief in a religious, in a religion that accepts the afterlife, I think they like to use that term soul. So for them, I'm being a little sloppy here, but I think for people of a faith, in an afterlife. I think they like to use the word soul. But to me, I think that's interchangeable with the idea or the concept of consciousness. So what is going on? And I guess I would ask the question here. Well, let me ask you this. Again, a show of hands. How many people think that there is a consciousness that's independent of, separate from, and not simply a product of your physical body? Okay, and I think that's consistent with your idea of an afterlife.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm more iffy on that question. Though.
Yeah. Okay.
If it's completely separate from.
Yeah. So everybody else here is saying that, I'm preaching to them. Maybe we can finish this up in the next few minutes. Yes.
I think your question that there is or there isn't, I would say, could there be? Well, there could be.
There could be.
There could be
A consciousness that's
beyond our individual thought, something that's collective or greater than. I'm not sure.
Okay. So what you're saying?
But maybe there is.
Let me try and interpret what you're
Sure.
saying. You're saying that there is I don't want to use the word collective consciousness.
I was throwing words together, but yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'm trying to interpret what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's separate from just what's going on inside your head. What's going on in your head is part of a larger collective.
There could be.
Could be. Okay.
Could you put it as who is agnostic about this question?
Yeah, sure. Oh, okay.
I'm not agnostic, but I have an opinion that's a little different.
Okay.
There's a probability for any amount of factors, and the probability is most likely that there isn't anything outside of the body with the current knowledge that we have.
Okay.
But our knowledge is so limited, I would not say anything is finite in that essence, and I'd give it a very high probability, but not a certainty.
Yeah.
Never a certainty.
Okay. Well, just to digress a moment, I couldn't disagree with that in the sense that almost any empirical question is a question of certainty, a degree of certainty. You could say that this is an old, but there could be a being under the ocean called Neptune. We just haven't found him yet.
Nobody named it Neptune yet. It's just a label.
Well, okay.
It could be easily done.
Yeah, I mean,
It's a probability.
Right. It's very, and the world could be the center of the universe.
Well, it kind of is. So is every other point, but whatever.
That's true. Yeah. But it could be the center. It could be that the sun revolves around the earth instead of.
Sure. Why not?
I mean, but
it's perspective.
At some point, we say to ourselves that I'm putting so much confidence in what our collective intelligence has created for us that I don't want to consider myself agnostic about that question anymore.
Well,
But you don't think we're there.
High level of certainty, extraordinarily high level of certainty with given knowledge. But, never 100%.
And I would say, just to sort of bring it back, I would say with respect to consciousness, and the idea that consciousness is really dependent on our physical, my degree of certainty and belief of that is lower than my degree of certainty and belief that the earth revolves around the sun. Okay. I don't think we are as...
There's a lot of supporting evidence for one of them, not so much for the other.
Not as much for the other, right. Yes.
I think it has to do with definition. To actually have any argument or discussion, you have to know the definition of the words that you're using. So when people say, I believe in a soul, you have to ask them, can you define that?
Yeah.
Because their definition of a soul might be different than
Yeah.
the actual definition of a soul, which I am not actually aware of.
Well,
What is it?
okay. That's really a good point. That's a good
And
point.
when people usually say soul, they mean something other than what is physical, something that cannot be
Yeah.
measured empirically. And if you're saying something can't be measured empirically, then obviously it's outside of our known universe.
Yeah.
Because we have laws that we can measure things like physics, biology, things like that. If it's outside of that, then and you can't measure it, then you're making things up. There's no rules. And if there's no rules, then why even bother to entertain the idea of the soul?
You're saying that because it's sort of we can't get our arms around it. We can't. It's intangible.
If there's no way to know it, and you can't know it.
Well, there is okay. That's a point I wanted to make a little bit later in the conversation. But the question is there some could you devise a test that would convince you that there is a soul?
Currently?
No.
No.
It matters on what they think a soul is.
Okay. All right. Let's back off. Because to me, this is fundamental to sort of how I develop beliefs about the world, and that is that I would like there to be, I'd like to have evidence that I would find convincing. Okay, there are some things that you can sort of devise an experiment to. And last time we talked about placebos. Jeremy talked about placebo. I thought it was excellent, and there's a lot of research that's been done on the effectiveness of placebos, and those are experimental designs that I think we can have some confidence in. Is there the same kind of experimental design that you could create that would let you know whether or not there is a, I'm not going to use the word soul, I'll use the word unconscious, or an afterlife, let's use that word, that would be persuasive to you. If there isn't, then you could argue that this discussion doesn't get anywhere. John?
To define our terms a little better, by afterlife you mean the consciousness of an individual lives on after physical death.
I think that's how I would try to define it. Yeah.
I have a hard time defining that because what is life then? That's the next.
Well, I think I'm not upset with your question. I think it's an excellent question.
Right.
I'm just upset that, well, I'm upset in part because it's not in my notes. And secondly, it's,
Sorry.
I'm saying, you're raising, and this is one of the reasons to have these sort of
Right.
get-togethers is to help us sort of, and for me, to sort of fumble my way through and maybe have a better understanding at the end of this than I do now.
I'm just critical, not trying to be harsh though.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I'm, unlike some people, I feel myself to be not thin-skinned. So, yeah.
Earlier, John, you said you believe you have a consciousness. I mean,
No.
while you're living, no? You don't.
Well.
See, yes.
I was going to try to refine that a little bit.
Okay.
But I will get back to that, yeah.
Well, the reason I say I asked the person what they define as soul is because definitions mean something.
Yeah.
If one cannot define their idea, then is it even an idea? It could be just a jest. If it's a jest,
Yeah.
then and not an idea, you can't really discuss that.
Well, okay, so let me try to define soul. Because soul is, people talk about, the plane went down and 50 souls were lost. Well,
Well, when I say we
but,
can't discuss it is if it's not an idea,
Yeah.
then it can't exist. It
Okay,
doesn't
well,
exist.
all right. So I'm going to claim that it is an idea, and that I equate soul with consciousness.
Okay.
Okay, and maybe a little bit more than that, because when you talk to a person of faith and say, well, what is the soul? They believe that it is somehow connected with God, or with some kind of religious component to it.
I would say spiritual. I've met many people who weren't religious at all and had ideas of souls and
Okay.
extra planar, extra body stuff, things that wouldn't exist within standard empirical science.
Yeah.
They weren't religious. They would not at all fit it anymore.
Okay, well, I mean, and that could be. But let me just sort of, for purposes of this, so we can get over this little hump here, maybe. For purposes of this discussion, that I would equate soul with consciousness. Okay, and so then it's a question of what is consciousness.
We did have a discussion on this at one point, by the way, with Joe. I think Joe led that.
Yeah.
And I don't think we came to any solidified.
No, and I
conclusions
think
either.
that's probably where everybody basically is, perhaps. If I had a view, and this is a slight digression, but if I had a view, I had a conversation. My father-in-law died, by the way, last month. In fact, a year ago, or a month ago tomorrow. He was 104, and he and I had a great relationship, and we talked a lot about philosophy. But he was uneducated, and so he was interested in science, but he didn't really have any background. It's a long digression, and so he and I once were talking about water, and he recognized that water is wet and that sort of thing, and he also recognized that water was H2O. It's a molecule of two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. But the way he saw it was that a glass of water was a lot of molecules of H2O floating around in the liquid, okay? Okay, I know, and I said, wait a minute, Frank. It is H2O. I mean, that's all. It isn't, there's no liquid there. That is H. But that's how we perceive it. We don't perceive it as individual molecules. We perceive it because there's so many billion of these molecules that we perceive it as simply a liquid. We don't perceive individual molecules. And I think when we are conscious, when we have a consciousness, it's simply the way our brains process stimuli, process things that go on in the brain. That's how, when we see things, it's really just our brains processing. That it isn't something beyond or in addition to the brain function. Okay?
Well, I think for the purposes of discussion, I mean, just as far as if you're talking about afterlife, most people are thinking about an individual's afterlife rather than like a group afterlife.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the mystical body of Christ or anything. We're talking about, do we have souls, kind of?
Yes, right. Do we have some kind of...
Right. Before you come into existence or are conceived, there is no consciousness for you. The consciousness that I believe I have today isn't there. Your body and mind come together and grow, etc., and now I have a consciousness. When I die, I will disintegrate, and that consciousness will be gone again. It'll evaporate.
Yeah. And there are a lot of religious people that disagree with that.
Oh, I know it.
I mean, they think that God has sort of a, he has, in his closet, he has all these souls that he can then sort of instill in humans as they, as they are born. Yeah. But I think that for people that...
So then our consciousness, or what many people call their soul, it comes at birth, and then the question is what happens at death? Does it go on somehow, as many Christians believe, without a body?
Yeah.
Or is the body going to rise again from the dead and be reconstituted, as many people believe that in Christianity it will, that heaven is actually a physical place and you'll physically be there again? Though you're unable to tell what age you'll be or how you're going to eat or anything, that's all, of course, left up in the air. But I believe that once I disintegrate, there's no way my consciousness can no longer exist because I'll be spread
Your
out.
consciousness is in effect
Physical, based on physical.
yeah, I mean it's really it's really dependent on your
Yeah,
physical
absolutely.
being. Yeah. But I don't think when we are growing up, and maybe some of you it's different, but when I was growing up, it seemed like the most normal thing, and everybody,
Me
if
too.
you asked anybody who would think about it, and frankly, kids don't think about this much, but if there was somebody who's thought about it, they'd say, well, yeah, I've got a mind, and my mind is in control. My mind, I decide, I do things, because in my mind, my consciousness, I decide to do that. Not that my body is simply, my mind is simply reflecting what my body is doing.
It's reflecting your surroundings entirely. You are an amalgamation of all sensory input and memory. Basically, nothing more than a reiteration and recompilation of that.
Okay.
And most people don't acknowledge that. That's my perspective, anyways.
Well, I think most people philosophically have to believe in more than that. Just if you're going to lead a moral existence, I mean, where you're,
If the community around you reflects the tendencies that we describe as moral, and you have amalgamated that into your system, then you are moral.
Oh, sure, no, I agree. You could explain things on that way, but at some point, I say to myself, I don't believe that. I believe that I actually do affect my world, and I have willpower, and therefore I have to make moral or
You
evil
absolutely
decisions.
affect your world, and in some ways maybe more than we realize, but that doesn't mean that we're in control of it by any standard.
I can't prove it, but I just say it anyway, even though I can't prove it. I think that's what
That's
faith
it.
is.
And yes.
Chris mentioned that we had a night where the topic was consciousness, and that it ended kind of different viewpoints, and there was no consensus.
Yeah.
The topic was really what is consciousness. We had another one on is there free will. I'll
Right.
who led that one.
That one
Joe
was
spoke
Joe
to
too,
it?
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Kevin brought Calcio as Joe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that was my first time.
So the interesting thing there was it was kind of more or less split 50-50. Is everything predetermined by the laws of physics and chemistry and psychiatry and all that, or do we actually have free will? And there was no consensus on the answer to those, but there was generally the consensus is that we all have the perception of free will. Whether it's really free or not, we don't know, but we know we have that perception of it. And I think that's kind of in a way analogous to the question of, that I think John is talking about. Everyone maybe has the feeling that and correctly, that there is individuality. I am a unique human being from every other one. And the subject of that sense being I, well, it sort of comes packaged with that this consciousness, this sense of that there's a person in there somewhere who's talking right now. Whether it's, I don't know yet that we are able to prove with the data that we have available and the means of study, the experimentation we were getting at earlier, to prove that. So I personally feel there will be a lot better answer to that question in 100 years than there is today. But there certainly is that perception that I am an agent, a free-thinking and causative agent. That being said, I still agree with you.
Well,
My
the way that
outlook goes a little deeper than standard physics as well. I'm even considering that we're on the topic of afterlives after all. I was going to bring up time. Our certainty of time is pretty limited.
Yeah.
We're pretty sure that there's an entropic value that we can see, and it's the general decay of the universe, and that's what time is. But we're very uncertain as to if it's in any particular order. There's evidence to suggest it might not go in any particular order, or that all the events have already occurred already. Not to say that there aren't multiple spectrums of events that could occur, but those are equally valid. So you're just experiencing one of them. It's a limited perception. That's the problem. So whether or not somebody dies when they actually die, I have no confidence of that either, because I don't know what time necessarily is. So there's a lot of deep questions in that field as well.
Yeah, at some point we all kind of develop our own
Oh, great.
version of the world. Yes.
I was
go ahead.
gonna say the way you put like the perception of being an individual, as far as like being unique from other people. I think that's different than saying that someone has free will. So I think there's better evidence that people are unique from other people than that their actions are not determined.
Yeah.
So.
I think what you're saying is that this idea of sort of individuality or uniqueness that we have is what contributes to our belief in our sort of our sense of making choices, of having free will. Not that it means that we do have free will, but it gives us this, helps to give us this, what I think is a very compelling sense of choice, which I think is totally illusory, but I think that we have this compelling feeling. We go to a restaurant, we choose what we're going to eat. We have this great confidence. I did this. I meaning some kind of agency. I could have chose something different, but I didn't.
Well, you probably chose all of them.
Yeah, I'm not saying I don't agree with that. I don't agree that we have that choice. But I do feel that for the most part, I have a sense of free choice, free will.
Yeah, I guess.
Not
to
always.
wrap up what I was bringing that up for was simply as an analogy of this thing about soul and afterlife.
No,
Similarly, people have that intuitive sense, and that's why it's like an 80% statistic that
Yeah.
you had. And unexamined, you just stay there, and as long as it doesn't do any harm to others,
I mean the sense of
that
freedom.
that there's a soul somewhere in here.
Oh, yeah.
That's different than my body and my mind, and that soul is going to exist after the body and the mind die. If you examine that, I don't think it holds up very well,
But I think I think that all of these ideas, the idea of freedom, and the idea of consciousness, because we seem to experience consciousness all the time. I think they're all related, interrelated with the idea of soul and the idea of an afterlife. Okay. I don't think that it has to follow that if you have a soul, that you must have an afterlife. I don't know that, and I have a question, I wanted to pose that question later in our conversation.
President What Soul asked at Priest at Notre Dame one time what the soul was, and he explained it in the way of like emergent properties, that like the body it's greater than the sum of its parts, right? The brain, you have all the neurons, but then you have consciousness on top of that, so that since the whole is equal and greater than the sum of the parts, what's left over is the soul. That's the
this emergent property is the soul.
Right, that's to balance the equation, and it actually fit at the time.
Yeah.
And then you would think the afterlife would. You say, well, then where does that go? It would go to wherever that is. I mean, I didn't ask for the afterlife, but that worked for a long time.
Well, if it has constituent parts and they're gone,
Say that again.
if this is what, okay, to me what you're saying is all these things added together are more than, there's a more than, and that's the soul.
Well, he just introduced that idea.
Right, and I'm saying, I'm poking the hole in it because if that's the case and you take all those parts away, then that extra thing's gone too. Why would it continue to?
The emergent property is only there because of the constituent parts, and if you took them away, there isn't anything
It's a
left.
parallel existence. Yeah. Would that make sense?
I would say that the flaw in the statement is that there's something greater. I highly doubt there is. Greatness is just a human construct.
You have a response to that?
I don't know. I mean, that's just what I was guessing. You know, that and to me, like with sci-fi and stuff, you know, there's beings of energy. There's other beings that like consume sentience. You know, I think this is why you get this number of 17% of agnostics believing in an afterlife because I don't know, you conceptualize it on TV, you can read about stuff like this. It's sort of you don't have anything to
I
disagree
can
with.
agree
It
that
seems
it's
neat.
way more complicated, but whether it's better or not is subjective.
Well, maybe like the idea is that it's exponential, meaning that like the parts
Oh.
contribute to each other.
Sure, that's part of the entropic value, though. That's nothing surprising. If anything, the system of complexity will always be increasing exponentially. That's just part of the curve, and we're part of that.
Actually, I just to sort of bring this back to your comment, I think I'm putting in a plug for Sean Carroll. He's a big hero of mine. I read The Big Picture. I don't know if other people have read that book. It's a brilliant book, and it came out last year. And he sort of tries to address a lot of these issues in that book, including this idea of emergent properties. And he said, there's nothing wrong with talking about emergent properties. We have to talk about it as a practical matter. We can't talk about, for example, in a glass of water, the emergent property is this liquid quality that we all experience with water. But if you got down to the molecular level, you wouldn't see this liquid quality, you just see all the molecules, he said. But we can't deal with all the molecules. It's just too much data, if you will. And so it makes total sense to deal with the liquid property, the fluid, the viscosity, or whatever, however you want to sort of characterize this. And he said, and it's the same thing with consciousness. Consciousness is in effect an emergent property, or it's a way of talking about it at a level that we can deal with. We can't deal with the individual subatomic particles that are being affected by the forces.
And it creates the problem too that the computers, if they got smart enough, right, they have emergent property, they would have a soul too if they became intelligent and conscious.
Well, I think they probably do, to the extent that we have souls.
Right. But you'd have to be fair, if you use that.
Well, what's wrong? What? You're laughing. You're laughing. It's okay.
Well, it seems fair to me.
Huh?
What you're saying seems fair to me. As much as we can have souls,
Yes.
they certainly can have souls too.
So animals can have souls.
Yes.
Well, I mean, and that's a question I wanted to ask is, do you think that dogs are conscious, for example?
No, I think cats are.
Cats on this side, dogs on this side.
Well, you had a great lecture on that, not to Bill gave a great lecture on, what kind of consciousness the dog has. And it has consciousness, but not near the level that we do.
Right.
And we're like
I
very
think it's
deep in that way.
I think it's a different type. I highly doubt we can evaluate its significance. A dog may have far higher amounts of perceptive ability and cognizant processing than we realize in a certain field that we can't analyze appropriately. I absolutely feel that most animals at our evolutionary rate who are mammalian have a significantly developed system of some kind that is nearly as advanced as ours. If they're alive now, they wouldn't have been otherwise.
Yeah. They don't produce any of it.
But this is being studied constantly. I think constant new stuff is being, as far as we consider something proved by science, is being added to all the time. I think we're going to come to understand the consciousness not only of animals but ourselves better, much better than we do now. Though whether we'll ever answer all the questions, no, we never will answer all the
There's such a high level of uncertainty is usually where I stand.
So I don't think dogs have ego. Or cats either. Although sometimes it seems. Yeah.
Could you clarify for me the idea of, this is bringing it back maybe 10, 15 minutes ago now, the idea of not having free will, even though you
Yes.
think you're...
Yeah, and let me...
I mean, I'm sitting here right now listening to you on my own choice. Is that, do you...
I make a distinction between choice and free will. Okay, I think we make choices all the time. I think the choices are dictated by our physical state. Okay, we don't perceive them as I said, we have this compelling feeling of having being able to make a free choice. But in my view, we don't. I mean, that's just an illusion. That's an illusion.
Have you experimented with that?
Can you give me an example of
Can
you give me an example of when you're sitting there and you're saying to yourself, wow, I thought I just had this moment of free will, but I'm just an illusion of...
Well, for example, when I go to a restaurant, I order fish instead of chicken. Okay, I have this feeling like I made that choice, that I could have made a different choice, but it's an illusion. Okay.
How is it you made the choice? Well, I guess...
Okay. Well, I have 85 billion neurons in my brain. Okay, and they, in effect, processed whatever stimuli went into that whole thing, and that's how it came out. So that they in effect caused my vocal system to tell the waitress I'm going to have fish.
So you're saying that the cells in your body work together to make
Yes,
you...
and let me just.
Yes.
It is okay.
Yeah.
So make a fist, okay? Make a fist. Okay. So what happened there? What happened was the reason your hand made a fist was because the muscles in your forearm contracted. How did that happen?
Because you told us to.
No. Let's take it one step at a time. What happened was the muscles contracted because there were a neural message sent down your nerves leading to your muscles. Okay, that was all biochemical. Okay, there was no. If you look at the reaction between your nerves and your muscles in your forearm, there was no sort of mental process that intervened that caused them. And you can track that all the way back up into your brain. There's no point, and this is the point that Sean Carroll makes to some extent in this book. Okay, that there isn't any place where, in effect, something other than physical, reactions occur in the whole process. There isn't any place where something else intervenes. It would be a disruption. It would be a break in the chain of cause and effect, the physical cause and effect that led to your making a fist. There isn't any place where that happens.
Do you think it's just we just can't detect it yet? We're just not...
Well, I mean, and he says it, he says it much better than I could say it. But what he says is, we understand the physics and chemistry of those processes. There isn't any place where something else comes in and makes and disrupts that process. That process is continuous.
Well, there is.
So what you're saying is we may have a choice, A and B. Choices are always there, but free will is something different than that. We always have desires, but those desires are, we have a predisposition, a physical one, or a chemical one, which is still physical, to have a desire, to make a choice. Therefore, because however you define free will, I'm not sure how you define free will outside of,
Well, I think you have to define it as something that breaks, that's counter-causal, that breaks the chain of cause and effect in the physical world. You have to have something that intervenes that does that. I don't think there is anything.
what would even do that?
Well, but scientifically, you can't prove there isn't something.
Principle.
No, but there's all kinds of things you can't prove.
Well, that's true, but I mean, like they haven't yet meshed quantum mechanics with all Einstein's theories. And we don't know exactly.
Sean Carroll covers that in his book too.
Okay,
I hate to keep talking about him,
Okay.
but the book is brilliant. Okay?
All right, I'll read it.
And he talks about everyday physics.
Yeah.
That in everyday physics, there is no,
Right.
there isn't
If
any
there's only
place.
the physical world, we have no free will. Yet we still, even though I believe many of my days, that is the truth, there is only the physical, I still believe almost most of the time, and certainly the way I run my life, that I have free will. And I just say I have it. You have to, well, what else could you do?
You can do it for fun.
We could all talk about this room maybe doesn't exist, you don't exist, my life never existed, yet we're going to walk out of here in an hour and I think
Non-physical. I don't ever get why people keep doing that. You know, it's either physical or non-physical. You can have an alternate reality with alternate laws of physics.
It's not even alternate. It's just
Grace.
Yeah,
Grace, answer the question, will you?
Well, okay, now I forget what I was going to say. I think one way, like, you could look at, like, why it feels like you're making a decision is that there's a process, like, that leads up to, like, an action. So, like, in economics, which I think, like, tries to relate itself to, like, psychology and neuroscience, basically it looks at how people make choices. It says that we maximize utility. And so if we're computers, that's what we're programmed to do, maximize utility, and also maximize our chance of survival. So I think before we do an action, there's, like, you could say there's a variation of probability between whether we're going to do that action, and when we actually do it is when sort of like the probability tilts based on whatever stimuli we're getting.
But it isn't something where you have something beyond, these factors that somehow intervenes.
So what we're perceiving is actually that there are different future possibilities, and then when one of those is realized, it feels like making a choice. That's what we call it.
Oh, okay. So you were saying that about not seeing the individual molecules, but seeing the water as a whole, because that's our perception.
We perceive ourselves processing information.
In my clumsy way, that's what I was trying to get at. That's sort of a way.
Yeah, and then also awareness has to do with that. Like awareness for us, we could see parts to a whole that an animal cannot see. So I was thinking, can we develop free will if our awareness would, get higher? The higher levels of awareness
What would it be where you develop free will?
Can't go below.
What you're making a joke.
Yeah. Just take where you can go.
Actually, I think
we can achieve free will.
I don't think we can achieve.
You can't even define free will.
Not even develop, like achieve it.
You can't even define free will. I don't think.
There are times, just sort of to elaborate on just a moment. There are times when I feel like I don't have free will. Okay, most of the time we feel like we're in control. Okay, we're making choices. But there are lots of times when I don't feel like I have. For example, I had a friend, a family member, who I disagreed with politically. A lot of us are in that position. And at the end of the day, she said, "John, will you forgive me?" And I felt like I don't have any control over whether I forgive you or not. And maybe at some point I will forgive you, but I can't just say, "I forgive you," when it's not there, okay? And it may come there. I bought a car recently, and I feel like it happened, okay? It wasn't necessarily the car that I was going out to buy, but I wound up buying it, and it was like I wasn't in control, okay? I mean, there are times when you feel you're not in control.
To Grace's point with computers, I've done some AI programming myself, and it's really fun when you're trying to do AI, trying to kind of build it in such a way where it does what you want, of course. Usually you have some type of goals, but puzzle navigation or maze navigation is one thing that you can do with AI. And often you may even have some kind of like greedy factor. You could even have, it almost sounds like human thoughts, like it's more greedy. So it's going to always go toward, like if it knows where the goal is at, where the end is at, it's going to always explore the ones that are closer to the goal first. Maybe the actual path is back away from the goal and around. A more greedy algorithm will always go toward the goal first.
These are algorithms.
Right, and I'm saying, right. And I'm
They're
saying,
not. You don't think that these programs have free will?
exactly, yes. So I'm saying it's, I think computers are a really good model to show how, basic logical decision making could be done. I mean, I've even thought of like more complex AI. It might almost seem like, like getting to the goal might be analogous to like pleasure for the program. And being farther away from it could almost be like, hey, you're kind of penalizing it. In a way, you could look at a person as, we're penalized for things that are bad for us, or we're rewarded for things that are good for us. I mean, if you look at it from a purely physical perspective, things like eating are obviously good for survival. Things like sex are obviously good for survival. So we have a positive feedback. We can write programs just like that as well.
They might not be conscious yet, though. There are things that we do unconsciously that we're still programmed to do. Like they don't necessarily have the sensors to experience pain or pleasure. They just do it.
So you don't need consciousness for that kind of decision making.
I have a question for you, Caleb. Do the programs rely at all on randomness or probability?
They some of them do. Some of them do.
Some of them do, some of them don't. Which ones exhibit more human-like tendencies?
It's hard to say actually. You can't necessarily. I mean, if you throw some randomness in there where they're not always going to make the exact same choice, well, that would be more like humans.
Do you think
Where would the consciousness of breathing or putting your hand on a fire and then removing it off really quickly come?
No, that's a really good question, because I've thought about this in terms of consciousness. We're not conscious of our digestive processes, even though they're controlled by our nervous system. We're not conscious of necessarily our heartbeats, other than we become aware of it, not because it's in our head that we're directing it, but because we can feel it, sense it. So yeah, I mean, our consciousness, whatever it is selective in terms of the kinds of neural activity that it's involved with. That's what that's the point you're making.
Because you cannot perceive it in this sense of us having a conversation, it's not a part of that consciousness. Could it be a subconscious?
Whatever that is.
Right?
I mean, subconscious, at some point you have to say to yourself, subconscious is simply neural activity that,
You're not aware.
yeah, so that's like saying, I don't know what that's saying.
I mean, is that consciousness as well?
What did you say?
It's like an OS system, operating system.
What, OS?
Yeah.
Operating system.
Yeah, it's like in the background of the computer doing all these things.
We don't know if...
You can't see it, but it's doing it.
Yeah. We don't know about the inner life of a computer as to whether there's a consciousness there.
Computer that could be as conscious.
Even with like pain stimuli.
Just talk
But you're right about...
He knows what I'm talking about.
Well, one point I wanted to make back to do computers have consciousness, ego? Do animals have ego? We talked about that a little bit. I can't remember the exact experiments, but I know they've done some types of experiments, animals, to see if they have like a sense of self. I think maybe looking at themselves in mirrors or something like that. I think it's usually been known. But
Well, cats are usually aware if they see something placed on. If they can notice that something's different on them in a mirror, they'll take it off. Parrots, dolphins, chimps, and some small species of reptile. But other than that, not really. Nothing else is. And I wouldn't necessarily call it recognition of self-awareness.
So you're sort of limiting it to mammals.
Well, birds are a variant of reptiles, or technically they're still dinosaurs. So
yeah, but an earthworm.
Squids are pretty good too. So dolphins, they're mammals though. sea mammals.
But even your reaction to pain, like, you know, they do with consciousness tests. If you're head injured, that's how you can determine how injured your brain is by putting like a central stimulus. You push down to make the sternum hurt, right? And you could be unconscious and just you want to get that away, right? You don't even have to remember that. But then, depending on how injured you are, if you do this is good. But if your hands go like this versus go like this, it's continuing to go down in your level of consciousness. And nothing at all. If you don't move at all, then you're at the lowest level. Like, you don't react to pain. That's all.
Yeah, but that's a scale for convenience for medical industry because there really are exhibitable traits that you can
I know, but it's not
regularly.
It's not like this. There's
Right,
a
right.
higher process in the brain that are blocked because you're injured.
Exactly.
Have a discussion about the afterlife. We're going to have to admit we have consciousness.
Is
We just
unconscious.
or at least take
Whether
that
or
as
not
a
the person
theory.
inside is conscious anymore.
How can we
You
like
can be
say?
paralyzed and have like your body can be paralyzed and still have like brain.
Yeah, you can feel it.
Stephen Hawking.
So where is the consciousness? Where does it lie?
Okay.
Right.
Where does it lie?
Yeah, where does it lie? Like, I mean, there's
We don't know.
some scientists are thinking of doing head transplants. Transplanting a head onto another body.
Yeah. It's been around for a while.
Well, good luck, right?
Well,
But,
when you say
use part of your brain.
where does your consciousness exist?
So
I have this.
Can I talk about squids super quick? Squids consciousness, we have no idea where it's located because as we dissect them and as they've been cut up.
Well, how do we know they're conscious?
Machinery, they seem to be able to process their independent body parts seem to be able to process information just like a brain would. So their whole body is like a processing consciousness.
Yeah, what about ants that build bridges
Where
for them to walk over each other's bodies?
Exactly.
They have a hive.
well, they actually do have a hive mind based off
Yeah.
chemical input.
Hive mind, yeah.
Sorry, I keep that wrong.
Well, it's different, but it's yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting question of where does consciousness lie. Like, when you're transplanting body parts, if you cut off your arm, you're still you. If you cut off your legs, you're still you. It's apparently not your heart either, right? Because there's heart transplants.
We used to think it was.
Right. And it's also not just every part of your brain, because people can have brain injuries and parts of their brain literally die. My current best guess is it's somewhere, I don't think it's only in the pineal gland, but I think the pineal gland probably plays...
Pineal gland.
Pineal gland.
That was Descartes. That was his claim.
And it's interesting because that's a lot of where people experience spiritual experiences. And I believe there's even instances of that being injured and people being unable to make choices.
All I know is if you want to kill a zombie, you shoot it in the head.
All right, so Fritz, your question was, where is the consciousness? And I guess I would say, where is the processing that we perceive as consciousness going on? Where is that going on? That's to me how.
It's everywhere. You could be conscious and not have the ability to create memories, right? But then you forget something 3 minutes later. Is that person conscious? Not in the way that we know it. So that's temporal lobe memory. Frontals, all your personality. It's everything working together there. So you can't pin down consciousness.
But it's all in your head.
Yeah.
I don't know. If you have your arm lopped off, your consciousness is going to change. You won't have the same outlook on life that you.
Yeah.
So we're trying to define.
Has anyone else heard the stories of transplants happening and then the person who received the organ starts having visions or dreams or cravings or things? Well, there are actual stories like this that people have reported.
But do you?
I think the implication is that some portion of our consciousness exists in every part of our body. I think is sort of what it suggests. But if if there are enough of those stories, if you believe those stories.
Okay, so that's a way. It's a segue here to bring us back to. One quick question.
If this doesn't segue into where you're going, then you just drop it, but it's a change in the subject completely. When the topic came out as Afterlife, one of the things that I thought of is I hear frequently from religious people that if this life is all there is, what a tragedy for people who have experienced so much suffering, and those wrongs are never made right. Alternatively, some of those same people will say, as I think all of us would, every day is inherently valuable. We should like live it as a gift, and not a gift that came from someone, but live each day. Each day has its inherent worth. To me, if there's no afterlife, that part that's that second is still true. Ultimately, maybe the wrongs aren't righted. I wonder what people in your conversations or in your own thoughts yourselves, how you interact with that notion that without an afterlife, somehow this life isn't the same.
I think that's a really good point, and it it's bringing us back to this idea. I guess I just want to wrap up this conversation about the soul and consciousness and free will. I think those are all totally interrelated. That we have this compelling sense of freedom of choice, and I think it's just integral with this idea of consciousness. And I think the consciousness, this sense of consciousness that we all experience, I assume. I can't look into your heads, but I assume that that's really what we're talking about, in my view, when we're talking about the soul. And without the consciousness having a sort of an independent existence, a sort of a freedom of action separate from physical being, that I think that, to me, that's persuasive that there isn't an afterlife unless you have a religious belief that somehow, sort of creates some kind of afterlife for your consciousness that you wouldn't have if we just talk about physical body. Okay. That's my view. And I see some people nodding their heads, some people looking at me like,
well, it's great for the concept of justice, like to think there's an afterlife for those that go through a heck of a lot of suffering, although the tyrant can capitalize on that too and think, well, I'll just screw them now because they'll be good later.
I think your idea of it's to me it's discouraging. It's not the right word. It troubles me that there are so many people in this world who have tragic lives, and if they don't have an afterlife, how do you justify that from a religious point of view? I have a great deal of trouble with that. That is the problem of theodicy. I don't know if people are familiar with that idea, that how can God be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent all at the same time? How can there be so much pain and suffering in the world? If God had control of this.
Question from a secular point of view, what is our response or our reply that life still is meaningful?
I think that is the response. I take great meaning from my life. I feel like I have a very rich life, but it's all in my daily life. It's not a promise of something beyond this life. I do want to talk about that a little bit.
Also, in order to basically maximize our choices, we need to have the most accurate information. So if we have a realistic view of whether there's an afterlife, then we're not basing our choices on wrong information. We can make our actual life. In other words, it's an incentive. If things are bad in this life, we should be troubled by them, and we should improve them as much as we can.
And that's the counter argument to Pascal's wager, really, to say, that Pascal's wager is that, why not believe in an afterlife, or why not believe in God? Because if you believe in God and you're right, you have this choice, you have a chance for eternal life. And if you don't believe in God and you're wrong, then you you really lost out.
I think that's a little different subject, because that's kind of like risk. It's like evaluating risk.
Yeah, it is.
And I think
But nobody does it that way. I mean, I don't say, I'm going to believe in God because what if there is a God, you know? I mean, you can't do that. I mean, I can't evaluate and say, I'll believe in God today because, you know.
And the best answer to that is which God you...
Well, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I've been told I'm going to believe in God just before I take my last breath.
But we just hope you don't
Like a lot of saints.
killed in an accident with a piano falling on you.
Yeah, right. Give that chance.
Just look at
Just so back to the, kind of where the soul at or whatever. One thing I want to throw out there is I think the Bible talks about there being the body and then the soul, and then a separate thing called the spirit. I can give you 2 passages about that later if you're curious. I think that, like the pineal gland, it seems like that's kind of, it almost seems like maybe if there is some kind of super physical, supernatural spirit, that's kind of where it would attach at. But that's not all there would need to be. There's clearly, it seems, this whole consciousness. We have consciousness, and a lot of that lies, I think, pretty clearly in the physical brain. So this idea of consciousness.
Maybe all of it.
Well, this idea of consciousness that we're talking about, I would call that the soul, and obviously we know what the body is. And then I have this other idea of a spirit that kind of attaches and makes right and wrong choices. But that's
and
kind
it attaches to your soul.
Yeah, to your soul.
Not your body.
Yeah, it's to your brain, I think.
Yeah, well, it don't have to be the material, because I haven't seen any physical object that attributes to me good or bad.
Getting back to the afterlife, John.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Are there any literate philosophies that have left records that didn't believe in the afterlife? Or does Confucianism not believe in afterlife? I'm looking for an example of a philosophy that doesn't have an afterlife.
That does not.
That does not, but was successful.
Well, I'm not an expert on other religions, but the goal of help me out here. Buddhism, the idea of ultimately reaching the point where
union with God,
where you no longer, enlightenment. So that that's the end, right?
Well, it's your ultimate goal is to achieve enlightenment to where you would be equal with a God.
And would you have an existence?
Yeah, you
would still have an existence.
You would exist outside of this existence.
Okay.
So, like, if you don't achieve enlightenment in this world,
So that's not the answer. Are there any?
Yeah, right.
Are there any philosophies or religions that don't believe in an afterlife and yet have existed through generations?
Yeah, well, Egyptians were Jews.
The afterlife.
To Caleb's point in the Bible, that whole Trinity spirit, that didn't come until the New Testament. The Old Testament clearly states that there is no afterlife. You go to Sheol, like that. If a witch came and resurrected your spirit, that'd be the only way. But in the Bible, it's a very new concept.
So the spirit lives on. You're saying resurrected?
No,
spirit.
you go to Sheol, you just don't exist. I mean, that was the Jewish take on the afterlife.
There's a couple takes on that.
The oldest?
Is there a viable?
Yes, there's a very old one. Advaita Gita, which is a take off of Hinduism, a very, very old sect that does not have gods or sects or anything. It just kind of embraces the innate nature of nothingness of the universe. It has no ties to normal religious practice. But
is that an ongoing religion?
Barely. I mean, I tried practicing it just for fun. It was an experiment.
Okay. I mean, but generally speaking, there aren't.
The Egyptians had the
afterlife,
final judgment. So where you go to paradise after Osiris weighed your heart.
So
but even like Neanderthals, I think sometimes bury their dead with flowers, and they would bury their.
But what I mean,
that sort of it seems to.
You can argue that that's an indication that they believed that they were going someplace, that there was an afterlife. But it could be simply a matter of respect. Could be. I mean, it's hard to interpret that.
Well,
I mean,
I
I could-
agree, there's no way to measure it, but
I could, if someone in my family died, I might want, it's just it's a matter of respect.
most of the philosophies that go around the world today and in the historical record seem to have had some kind of belief in it. And they certainly sort of had a belief in free will and consciousness that men have. Now, whether they were right or wrong, but they did have that.
Well,
So
and the
it's a
question
very
I-
common thing.
So the question,
We need an anthropologist.
Right.
Sure.
Because we don't want to talk about Western cultures and that. You want to think about what other people think.
I do.
I think so, to get answers like that. You don't want conventional religions, because we all know these conventional religions. We want to know something different, that maybe has fundamental differences that would be a challenge for us to understand and explore.
I agree. That's very hard to bring to the macro level.
No, we just need an anthropologist.
Well, let me ask, sort of along those lines, let me ask this. What are the arguments in favor of the existence of an afterlife? Remember, I asked the question, what evidence could someone present that would change your mind other than your mind, which you already... I mean, for everybody else who's either agnostic or a non-believer in the afterlife, what evidence could somebody present to you that would? I mean, what evidence is there? And there is evidence. There's evidence in the sense that there's.
Measurable soul, if there's a way to detect it.
But we may not respect this evidence, but there's all kinds of evidence for people. There's
Spiritual act, communicate with the living,
right.
through mediums.
Right. And there's stories of, there's
people when they pray,
accounts of
they
ghosts.
feel the presence of the dead.
Exactly. And people, there's seances. So there is evidence. It's that we don't respect that evidence. Is that what we're saying?
But the next question would be, should we respect the evidence that exists? That's the next question. Because if you're looking for anything to question, it would be what we already have.
Yeah.
So, like the evidence that there isn't an afterlife, what's there to question there?
I think it's a question. So I was setting this up for a comment I was going to make, which is, I think we all evaluate evidence and sort of evaluate and say some evidence is better evidence than other evidence. And we all might have a slightly different take on that. But I think there is abundant evidence of an afterlife in the sense of there are accounts of people that that talk to dead, to the dead. There's writings. There's all kinds of writings. There's subjective evidence that people experience. So we're not giving that the same level of respect that we give to evidence that's based on, say, scientific.
Other explanations.
Yeah.
So I don't know how popular this was, but just looking here real quick, I won't elaborate too much. The Sadducees. There you go.
Sadducees.
Founded 167 BC, dissolved around 73 CE, according to Josephus. It was part of the upper social and economic echelon of Judean society. It says here, according to Josephus, they believe that there is no fate. God does not commit evil. Man has free will. Man has a free choice of good or evil. Soul is not immortal. There is no afterlife. There are no rewards or penalties after death.
But they did believe in the soul.
Right. I think you can believe in a soul and not believe in the afterlife.
Sure.
But I think it's difficult to believe in the afterlife without
a soul.
Without a soul.
They do not believe in the resurrection of the dead. So
The Sadducees, yes, compared to the Pharisees. Okay.
One of the problems with the experiential evidence that people have is its inconsistency. So if you apply the same standards to that as we do to scientific inquiry in general, you're going to have the problems that it's inconsistent. So in other words, it's not reproducible. Like one person, say, doing the same ritual isn't going to have the same result as another person.
So you're saying that the evidence? Oh, my notes. The evidence is anecdotal, as opposed to.
And sometimes contradictory.
Yeah. Okay.
One person's.
Well, I think we all have to decide, what kind of evidence we respect and what and question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have a history of the use of some kind of evidence being much more successful in advancing our understanding of the world than other evidence.
In terms of scientific evidence, I always have to say it has to be a probability. It can't be a certainty. There can be very high levels of probability, but there are no certainties, even in this field, especially when we're looking at it from, is the evidence viable? Well, yes, it's reproducible. Yes, you can see all these things that show that we don't have any changes physically right now, but science is a very fast-changing field. And as we're on the exponential curve of knowledge growth, we'll see that come in a few years, for sure.
Depending on what field of science you're looking at, I mean, there's so much of science is very political and
Yes.
very hampered and influenced.
It's a huge variable. I have no idea where it's going entirely either. I wouldn't stake any claims.
Well, and then going back to the point about anecdotal evidence, that's absolutely true. But at the same time, before the scientific method was developed, there's all kinds of medicine and practices that people used for thousands of years that were based more on anecdote than on.
There's also a lot that fail.
But just sort of help support your point. To support your point of view, anecdotal evidence is really the fuel for scientific research. People have an experience. Okay, that's a one-off experience. That's anecdotal. But that's the germ for a hypothesis that then can be tested scientifically. I mean, there's nothing wrong with anecdotal evidence. The problem is that you can't rely just on that. You have to then subject that.
Well, I guess it's what you feel comfortable with and where you want to hang your hat. I mean, if you only want to hang your hat on science, then that's that. That's a very clear.
I have to say something on that note for sure, because as of recent, we've just discovered another form of liquid water. No one's heard about that. There's a massive difference between water at 60 degrees Celsius compared to water below that at a liquid state. It has more electrical charge than in other states. Have you heard about that, or was that just proven recently?
I actually heard about that.
What have you heard about that? I read a couple articles a few days ago.
I've heard about it.
We'll have to let that do the last one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't get to everything on my list, but I got to about where I thought we would get, which is we would have a fairly long discussion on what is the soul, and I appreciate your comment about, we need to define what we're talking about. I think that was a really cogent comment. And I do think that when we're talking about the afterlife, we're really talking about what you could call a soul. And the soul, in my mind, is more or less equivalent to what we perceive as the unconscious. And there is no free will. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
So thank you again to everyone for coming. We're not kicking you out. Feel free to hang out and talk. We are working on some big things, as Brian mentioned. We are having an event at the PAPS on September 30th, so check that out. bringing a bunch of speakers in from around the world. And Tuesdays, we do this every other Tuesday. If there's a topic you want to present on or just discuss or lead a discussion, you can see it's informal. Ignore the cameras, sorry. That's just for our practice here. If you don't want to be filmed, we won't film you.
It's a shock.
It's a little bit of a shock. But, yeah, so let us know. If there is a topic you want to present, we are open as of next Tuesday, the next 2 weeks from now, Tuesday. So let us know.
And some of the older ones are online too.
And yeah, some of the older ones are online. The podcast is online. So
Let
thanks
me-
again.
Let me make one last plug for Sean Carroll's book, The Big Picture. It's a brilliant book.
There it is. We'll have him on the show Sunday.